Thank you for listening. So next we're going to have Dr. Sandra Joy, who, as I said before, is Associate Professor of the Sociology Department, speaking on mortality and mass incarceration.
It's not on. You want it on?
I don't know. Do I need it? It's
You know how to talk.
I could put it on.
How's this? Can you guys hear me? Okay, great. I just know it's very loud with the air conditioning. First off, I'd like to thank Bob and others who invited me to be on this panel very much, and I appreciate the hard work that's being put into Decarcerate New Jersey, and it's an honor to be a part of this wonderful tour that's happening and to be alongside such wonderful speakers. And thank you all for coming out on this nasty night on a Friday night, no less. I was really worried we wouldn't get many students because I know Friday, a little closer, is that better? Oh, good. On Friday, I know people head home for the weekend, so thank you for sticking around and coming out for this really important event. It's obvious that mass incarceration is an issue that concerns all of you for you to be here on a Friday night. I want to thank you for being here. So mass incarceration, that's the main topic that is, I say, the social problem, social issue of our time that we need to deal with. As Michelle Alexander's called it, the new Jim Crow. And if you haven't read that book, I really encourage you to get a copy of The New Jim Crow. It does outline why mass incarceration is such a central, important issue of our time. You may have heard already that we have over 2.4 million people behind bars in our country. And while we make up 5%, this is another prevalent statistic you may have heard, 5% of the world's population, 25% of the world's incarcerated. So what's wrong with that, the picture? Obviously there's a big problem with that, and something that we need to address. There are many issues stemming around the mass incarceration of largely people of color. You know, when you look at the numbers, it's largely Black and Latino people who are behind bars. And so you cannot remove the racial aspect of mass incarceration from this issue. It's central, it's key, and one that needs to be given the utmost attention. But since there are many ways to look at this issue, I'm going to be looking at just one. And I'm going to do, as I was asked, to keep my comments as best as I can to 10 minutes, because we do want to allow a lot of time for discussion. Okay, so I want to look at some of the reasons why, as you know, the gentleman said earlier, I'm going to be focusing on incarceration and mortality. Okay, basically looking at the lifespan of prisoners, healthcare crisis that we have in our prisons and jails across the country, and what is going on there. Well, there are many factors that are playing into this healthcare crisis, and perhaps you've been hearing some of the stories in the news. It's pretty much, if you look hard enough, a daily news story. Just like police brutality is becoming a daily news event around the country, so are the healthcare concerns in our prison systems. And one of the main reasons we're seeing such a crisis in terms of healthcare and the decreased lifespan of prisoners has to do with the aging of our prison population. Why do we have so many people behind bars at such older ages? Well, you know, there's this, in the 70s, we stopped doing life with the possibility of parole, and pretty much states around the country threw LWOP out, life without the possibility of parole. During this harsh sentencing, tough on crime period, and California is one of the most guilty of this. So if you look at the statistics in California, they're building prisons, and around the nation as well, but particularly in California, faster than they could fill them, faster than they could staff them or pay people. So the prison industrial complex you may have heard of, this business of incarceration that keeps people in jobs around the country has been guilty of, has been accused of a big impetus behind this life without the possibility of parole. What we didn't foresee, or maybe people, the powers that be did foresee and didn't really care, is that these persons who would be aging later would create this huge health crisis behind bars. In fact, nationally speaking, the number of inmates 55 and older in state and federal prisons has increased by 204% between 1999 and 2012. Okay, that's just one statistic. And I have a lot of statistics I could throw at you. I'm not going to do too many of that, but there's certainly a lot of statistics that would speak to how serious this problem is. So that's one of the issues that's going on. These harsh sentences and life without the possibility of parole, now we're seeing the seeds of that tough on crime era. And we also see an emphasis on security above all else. Okay, so what does that mean? When we put people in secure facilities, secure housing facilities, then there are a lot of mental health issues that occur because You know, as the Geneva Convention would say, solitary confinement is unjust and causes people to have mental health issues as well as neglect of their physical issues because they're put away and they're not being cared for. I do want to share a couple of quick stories with you to illustrate this. Certainly we've seen increasingly privatization of our prisons. And what happens with privatization? Profit is being put above the care of people. And that's in any institution in our society, really. There's been concerns of privatization of our school system as an example. Within the prison system, with privatization, the goal is to save money, you know, to cut costs as much as possible, to make profit. Because if you're making profit off of your inmates, then you want to make as much profit as you can. That's the capitalist way, right? Mm-hmm. And so inmates are not receiving the care that they are due. As a result of such legislation that we see, not to pick on California, but that's one state that's certainly got a lot of attention, the 3 strikes you're out, mandatory minimums and such legislation that came about, and automatic natural life sentence, life without parole, increasingly around the country, we've seen overcrowding of our prisons. And to the extent that in 2009, the California Supreme Court mandated that the governor and powers that be in California reduced their prison population by the tens of thousands. I don't remember the exact number. It was over 10, 20,000 inmates. Governor Brown has balked at this and has put out pretty much some lies about statistics and misinterpreting what's going on behind the prisons and has not been following through. Luckily, the California Supreme Court is coming back at him and holding him his feet to the fire. I heard a story recently about what might be going on there, and this blends the whole privatization issue with this as well. Inmates in California have been used to put out these fires. You've heard about the forest fires in California? Well, prison labor has been used to try and put out the fires, and so they can do that at a very low cost with inmates. And so they have more invested in keeping them incarcerated so they can be there to help with that, because they cannot afford, the state cannot afford to hire the firefighters at the rate that they would normally get paid to put out the fires. So that's one reason, just one example of the privatization problem in California that is keeping people incarcerated. But again, with overcrowding, health issues arise. Illnesses like tuberculosis, hepatitis C, HIV, all of these sort of communicable diseases are much more prevalent when you have overcrowding. You have people literally sleeping on top of each other in cells that are meant for 2 people. You might have 4, 6, 8 or more in cells. And the pictures that came out in 2009 in California were horrific. And they made the press, but they're all over the country. It's just one illustration of that. Another reason, and I'm going to give you a couple examples here after I put these out there, for the poor health conditions and the premature death of inmates has to do with revenge, quite honestly, by the powers within the prison system when you have people who speak out against the prison conditions. Anytime there's a grievance, maybe there are women being sexually abused, for instance, and there's a case here about that, I believe in Florida, I'll share with you. And you speak out against that, there's retaliation by the prison guards and those working in the prisons. And so there have been premature deaths, suspicious deaths that have been deemed natural causes, but then in further investigation, it was obviously not a natural cause. So when you have really harsh treatment of your inmates and abuse, not just harsh, but outright abuse, and people speaking out against it, that can definitely contribute to the poor health care and the premature death. And then most blatantly is the othering of prisoners. You know, when we consider them others, marginalize them, the racism and classism that comes with our treatment of inmates definitely can add stress to inmates behind bars, make them feel disempowered, and that stress has been known to break down your immune system and cause illnesses that would not normally be present. And there's very racialized rhetoric around such illnesses as HIV, drug abuse, crime. All of these terms have been racialized, and they've been deemed to be more prevalent among persons of color. So real quickly, I want to share a couple of cases, and please do not see these as, every blue moon sort of cases. These are all too often all par for the course, okay? And they happen on a regular basis. These are just some of many, many cases that we could be talking about. There's a case of Rikers Island inmate who was literally baked to death in his cell. Okay, this gentleman, an ex-Marine who had a mental health problem, mental illness, baked inside his 101 degree Fahrenheit jail cell in a Rikers Island unit for mentally ill inmates. The prison guard who had claimed to be checking on him every half hour, every 20 minutes or so, was found not to have done so for 4 or 5 hours or more. She was just filling it in the logbook, and they could simply look at the camera to see that it wasn't being done. So she is facing up to 4 years if she's convicted on all counts of that death by this inmate. This inmate, his first name, his last name is Murdo. Mr. Murdo suffered from bipolar disease and bipolar disorder and schizophrenia. He was on psychotropic drugs, which has been known to make people more sensitive to heat than otherwise. His crime, Murdo had been arrested on a misdemeanor trespassing charge for sleeping in an enclosed stairwell in a Harlem public housing building. Sent to Rikers Island after being unable to make a $2,500 bail. So that was his crime. A misdemeanor of sleeping in a stairwell, a mentally ill man, was sent to Rikers Island for a death. Basically, this is essentially the death penalty he got for sleeping in a stairwell, okay? Because that's exactly what happened. He was killed for that. His family didn't learn about his death until they were contacted nearly a month later by the Associated Press, not by the prison. Okay, so this is one example. And I'm sorry I have to share such horrific stories, but it's important that we look at what's going on behind our prisons. There's another case, Darren Rainey, age 50. In 2012, he died at Dade Correctional Facility in Miami-Dade area. Also mentally ill. He was a fellow inmate, Joyner, had been asked to clean up a cell. When he was cleaning up a cell, he saw something that shook him to his core, and that was basically the skin of this inmate, Darren Rainey. Large chunks of human skin. Because what had happened, they had handcuffed him and locked him in a cell the night before, and then they ran scalding hot water for hours, allegedly as punishment for defecating in his cell. He was screaming, you know, please stop, I'm sorry, and they would simply go by and taunt him and say, how do you like your shower? So he was scalded to death. That's another case of an inmate, and that's in Florida. Florida, by the way, is being investigated for over 200 suspicious deaths. One of them is LaTondra Ellington, a 36-year-old mother of 4 children who was only 7 months shy of being released. And this is a case of someone who was filing a grievance against a correction officer who had been harassing her sexually and otherwise, and so she was retaliated against. And they said she died of natural causes, but an autopsy revealed that she had trauma to the abdomen, and she had basically been kicked and stomped to death. So these are, you know, and sadly, I could go on and on with many such cases. In the interest of time, I will not, but just know that these are not out of the norm. They are very much the norm, and it happens over and over and over again. Why do we know about them? Because this is not the type of stuff that makes the news, right? This is not the stuff that people want to talk about, and who are controlling the prison system and the court system, et cetera, the media. So you might think, well, let's get these guys out of jail. You know, once they get out of jail, then they can have a healthy life, right? Then they can be just like you and I, and their life expectancy will increase. Well, there's a study recently that just came out this last May that found ex-prisoners are more likely to die an early death. Ex-prisoners. Men who are incarcerated and released are more than twice as likely to die prematurely as those who have not been imprisoned. So just like Michelle Alexander talks about in the New Jim Crow, about the difficult life and the challenges that ex-offenders face with the F word, right? The felon is the new N word. She talks about that, and all the stigma that comes along with being labeled a felon, and housing and employment, socially, et cetera, et cetera. All of these stresses put on ex-offenders can, again, the stress and racism, et cetera, can reduce their immunity, okay? So they also are more likely to have had a communicable disease while they were locked up. So the stress of being reentering society that is not welcoming to them, that stigmatizes them, makes them more likely to die of overdose, drug addiction, and homicide than people who don't spend any time in prison. So it's important to know that these inmates that come out, if to the extent that we, and this is unfortunate the way things are more and more these days in our society, we have to, well, how does this affect me? Well, guess what? The health outcomes, mortality rates of ex-inmates also have serious health implications for the communities where men live after prison and therefore deserve further study, if only because they come into our communities with these illnesses. And if we can't care about them, which I believe we should, also look at the impact that they have upon the communities that they reside in when they come out. And I could spend, and I won't, but I could spend much more time talking about what's often called the collateral damage of mass incarceration, and that is the families and the communities left behind and the ongoing problems that they have as a result of mass incarceration, which is a whole other topic. So, this mortality issue, health crisis that we're seeing within our prisons and the inmates who come out is only one of many issues that mass incarceration causes to primarily black and brown communities because of the racism involved, but we all should be concerned about it because it is a problem that we all should be concerned about. We're all facing